anybody who attends will have a copy of the recording. And welcome everybody to kick off. Would love to have our panelists introduce themselves. I can go first. My name is Reza. I'm the CEO of Motion. We're a creative analytics platform. We help teams figure out what creative is working best and why, and like share those insights visually with the rest of the team. Excited to host this panel today. We think about creative a lot. We kind of meet a lot of different people through the work that we do in Motion. And all three of the panelists here are people that I respect a lot and I think have some really amazing insights to share with all of you. So I'm excited to have them here and jump into a conversation today around creative strategy, and in particular, how do we think about a data-driven approach to creative strategy among growth teams as a way to accelerate growth in the kind of environment that we're in. So a lot of interesting things to talk about. We'll have some time towards the end for questions. So if you have any that come up, feel free to like dump it into the chat and we can work with that as you have it, but we'll also try to allocate a good like 10-15 minutes towards the end specifically for questions. So we'll make time for that. And so, yeah, to kick off, would love for the three of you to just give a quick background, maybe like a synopsis of your career, what sort of things you've been up to prior to your current roles, and then talk a little bit about what you're currently up to at your different companies. And so maybe we could do Rose, Gareth, and then Seiya.
Cool. Hi. I'm Rose. I'm currently the VP of Growth at Very Great. I started out my career more on the fashion side of things, actually, in social and e-commerce for several years, and then went over to agency side for several years, and then came back from what some might call the dark side, right? Back over to brand side about 6 months ago. So I just started at Very Great around the beginning of the year. Very Great is what we call a platform, but what you might think of as a kind of modern parent company that is very digital and e-commerce driven. We have 3 brands under our umbrella right now, Wild One, W&P, and Courant. And then we have a 4th brand launching later this year that I unfortunately cannot share much about, but we are very excited to have that roll out later this year.
Thanks, Rose.
Awesome. I'm Gareth. I'm the CMO of Pela. So we're the creators of Lomi, the countertop composter that's hopefully all over your YouTube while you watch it, as well as Pela Case, which is the world's first biodegradable line of mobile accessories. So yeah, it's been great to be just partnered up with Matt over there, the CEO, Pela, long-term friend of mine. Before that, I just lots of different entrepreneur stuff. I started my first company, Rockwell Razors, when I was still in university, and it was just trying to make like eco-friendly razors. Led to starting a bunch of different eco-friendly companies, and brought me to today, where we're scaling up beyond 9 figures of eco products. So yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me here. My name is Seiya. So I head up marketing within 30 Madison, which is a healthcare company helping people living with chronic conditions. And so, prior to this, I've been, in the tech space for quite a while now. Actually, I started my career out in Tokyo, even though I'm from New York City, and sort of fell in love with the startup scene there. And I've seen everything from, pre-Series A, all the way up to, basically IPO stage companies, which has been always like a very interesting journey to be in. So, and doing everything from, D2C, SaaS, even like tech education, stuff like that. So sort of a varied sort of degree of industry, knowledge as well that I'm happy to get into if there's interest. So going back to 30 Madison, like I said, we're building a platform for people with chronic conditions. We're helping those with higher acuity conditions such as migraines, all the way down to sort of less complex medically conditions like hair loss. And I mostly work on the Keeps brand, which you may have heard about. We are the first and only partner you'd ever need to control hair loss. And we provide treatment, options to men experiencing hair loss, no matter where they are in their journey. And we actually just opened up an in-person, hair restoration studio in New York City as well, that I'm happy to, talk about. We have about 7 brands within 30 Madison, and happy to sort of also go through the complications of that as well. But good to be here, Reza. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. Thank you all for joining. And so want to dive into a series of questions, and obviously want to talk about creative and the role that plays. But the kind of backdrop that I think a lot of companies, a lot of leaders are operating under right now is this environment of like, a lot of things at the macro environment are changing, interest rates going up, financial markets tanking. And that doesn't necessarily impact our roles day to day, but it has such a big impact on the economy that one of the things that I would love to understand is, as growth leaders at some pretty kind of high growth, high volume businesses, are you seeing an impact there? Like, have you noticed that, going from like the kind of frothy times that we're in just 6-7 months ago to things tightening up, the world potentially preparing for a bit of a recession? Like, do you see that changing at all in your day-to-day life? Like, is that a factor at all in the way that you're budgeting and the way that you're planning and the way that you're going about your growth program? I'm just curious how, if at all, that kind of macro environment impacts you. And any one of you could just jump first.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
I
happy
think-
to. Oh, sorry,
Go for
Gareth, please.
No, nail it. Go for it.
No, it's been so for me, it's been an interesting period, right? So I've been at 30 Madison for about 2 years. Like, obviously, the onset of the pandemic, caused telemedicine to rise, substantially, right? Usage of telemedicine to rise substantially. It's still a lower percentage of all sort of medical, treatments and visits, but obviously, it's been exponential growth in that sense. And so comparing to that period of time, obviously, last year as a growth leader, I think, as probably everyone on this call can attest to, how amazing their Facebook ads are probably performing versus, a few years back. We've seen certain headwinds, coming from that on growth. And if you think about, Reza, to your point with this question, if you think about like the next stage of our experience, it's something that we just need to be more mindful about, right? Like, I think that, sort of a growth at all costs type of mindset is definitely, you can already see, companies that have had that type of experience, going through layoffs and stuff like that, right? And I think that we're trying to be mindful of understanding all the metrics that power our business, and not just, at the end of the day, customer acquisition growth and, all that kind of stuff, but really, understanding the grand scheme of things, like the health of our businesses. So it's been an area in which we're talking, a lot about, right? Because we still want to be able to grow. We still want to be able to, especially, in the healthcare space, being able to break down the barriers of specialist care is really, really important to us, but we need to do so in a way that actually makes sense to the bottom line of our business, which I think might be, a slight change to, a few years back, like I said, when we were, simply capturing like a good part of like industry demand.
Yeah, we're experiencing a lot of the similar stuff. I mean, in terms of business strategy changes, apart from going back and renegotiating some software contracts, that's a really great way to find some cost savings. We've really tried to continue to approach growth from the same perspective. I think what's just come out of the last couple of months is the importance of meeting customers where they're at. So we actually had like a couple of hero pieces of creative that had done super well since Lomi launched, went from zero to not existing in April 2021 to over $100 million now, like 13 months later. A couple of those hero pieces of content that really focused in on particular like environmental benefit. I don't want to say people stop caring about like the environment and how we speak to them in their ads, but meeting them where they're at, addressing pain points that are more current around like take one more chore out of your life, make your life more simple, taking away that consumer pain that they're experiencing at this moment. Like, you just really need, we're finding it's much more important to be nimble. Unfortunately, I've got just a kick-ass creative team that I'm privileged to work with every day. I see a couple of them in this chat, so I guess that they've joined. But so checking this out. But we've just found that it's important to, instead of getting really affixed onto this one like kind of piece of creative narrative, to test a dramatic number of different things constantly. So that's just become kind of part of our cadence now, rather than making small tweaks to one major hero video as part of our top of funnel, just trying to meet customers where they're at with a bunch of different top of funnel messaging.
Just one follow-up to that, Gareth, and then Rose would love to hear your thoughts on that as well. So you mentioned that a lot of the ways that you're sort of adapting is thinking about how these sorts of things are impacting the consumer mindset and like adapting the way that you speak to them from the standpoint of like budgeting, forecasting, planning, bottom line, like all of those things are they relatively similar for you to what they were like last year, let's say?
They're relatively similar. We're fortunate that we've always just been a contribution margin focused business. Like there's never any point when we've sort of convinced ourselves like, okay, no, pay anything, chalk it up to brand marketing, and we're going to operate on some sort of like speculative 3-month payback period. I don't think anyone on this call probably does that, but like you can find a lot of examples of businesses that have gotten into hot water because that's what their financial model required. Despite the fact that Lomi is obviously a brand new consumer electronic hardware, like the margins are not tremendous in that category. So that's always been the important part, to find that day zero contribution margin profitability. And we continue to focus on that. So if we had a different ethos leading into whatever it is that this period turns out to be, I think my answer would be different. We would have had to make harder pivots, but it's actually just more of the same. And if anything, the macro environment just gives us more of a rallying flag around to be like, it's happening. So we're in a good position. We always have been in a good position, and just keep doing even more of what we've been doing, but with even more justification now.
Cool. And Rose, what's it been like? I guess you've joined the Very Great team, you said about 6 months ago. So you kind of jumped in right when these sorts of changes started to really materialize. How's that been like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think what was so appealing to me about Very Great as somebody to come over here and work here, and having spent so much time, having spent 5 years on the agency side, is I saw a lot on the agency side. I saw a lot of good. I saw a lot of bad. I saw a lot of in between, right? And how brands were approaching marketing and growth and kind of their overall approach to scaling their businesses, right? And I think, like to what Seiya was saying, right? It used to be like, hey, go fundraise a bunch of money, go spend it really fast, get a bunch of awareness, acquire a bunch of customers, and like figure out what to do with them later, right? And I think that has shifted so massively in the last few years for so many brands. And I think for Very Great, what it sets us apart and makes us a little bit more unique than some of these other companies that have taken a similar approach is we are diversified in a lot of different ways, right? We're diversified from an omni-channel retail presence, right? The brands didn't launch and go, hey, we're going to just try and do this online, right? Because what we're seeing now is all those brands that started and we're like, we're going to just stick to online. We're not going to have wholesale and retail partners. And we're going to try and grow this through Facebook ads, is they're now paying 4, 5, 6, 10 times as much as they were before, right? And so we're diversified from a retail presence. We're diversified in the verticals that we're in across our 3 brands right now. And our 4th brand that I mentioned at the beginning is in a new vertical as well. And we're diversified in the way that we approach speaking to our customers too. And I think, having not putting all your eggs in one basket per se is kind of the best way to approach kind of this macro environment, right? And so I think we're, as a company, feel really good about the position we're in. And my role at Very Great, what I often kind of describe to people is, I get a lot of questions about like, okay, but what do you actually do? Because you're not working at the brand, right? You're working for this other company that is part of this too, right? Is like, we're really kind of viewing it as this sort of centralized place of excellence for the brands, right? Like a centralized location for us to do creative, to do data, to approach marketing and things like that, and to share the information across the brands. So no one brand is working in a silo. And I think that all of that has put us in a really strong position as we go into, a macro environment that doesn't look so great to a lot of people. I think that it's put us in a good position going forward.
Cool. Yeah, that's awesome. And so it sounds like for a lot of you, the approach to growth has been, a more of like a common sense approach. Can't be lighting money on fire. It's got to make sense. It has to be something that works, has to be efficient. And so that's the sort of the lens that I've understood the 3 of you kind of think about your go-to-market strategies. And in kind of conversations with all 3 of you, I've come to understand like creative as a topic is something that's pretty top of mind for all of you. Where does that fit into this kind of thinking as a growth leader, as you think about your go-to-market strategies? What role does creative play? How does that fit into your approach to how you're designing these kind of growth programs based on the kinds of objectives that you've talked about?
Yeah, it's a huge part. I think Gareth touched upon this in his earlier response about like meeting the customers where they are and sort of being able to tell that story. I think especially in the healthcare space, And even for sort of less medically complex conditions like keeps and hair loss, it's still a really emotional moment for many guys that come to us, right? Like they don't necessarily know what their options are. A lot of times for folks, hair can be a pretty cultural thing as well. And so we have to be really sensitive around that type of messaging and like what does work, especially if you think about like the telemedicine space and how it sometimes can be perceived. And that's something that we are really conscious of when we do create the right types of messaging, like making sure that it is heartfelt, like it comes, a lot of the stories, like we shot a new commercial last year. And we literally used our actual customers to help tell that story, not in like an infomercial sense, but just in a way of walking them through the story of how they felt when they started losing their hair, to how they found us, to how we helped sort of change the perceptions and all that kind of stuff, right? Because it shouldn't be something that's shameful or an issue for many of the guys that come to us. And so that's been a really huge part, and being able to translate that at scale to Facebook campaigns and paid social campaigns is really important, to have that connection between not just the growth side but also the brand portion, as well as Gareth mentioned too, as an area of focus, building that top of funnel. That's been something really important for us. And I saw a few people in the chat saying they're from New York City, and so that's one way in which we I don't know if you've seen the Keeps ads that are sort of on the streets right now, but that's one way that we try to approach it, because there's even the different types of guys that have asked us questions, whether you may be a little bit older, or whether you're BIPOC or something like that, and you're asking questions like, do the products work for me? Like we are really trying to make sure that type of messaging remains consistent throughout our entire, like from growth to brand to how you experience care within our platform, because ultimately it's all tied together as part of that experience. So it's been a huge key part of like how we approach growth and just customer acquisition and and that experience in general.
And Rose, you mentioned the kind of the center of excellence portion of the way that the companies are being designed. Like, is that, and you mentioned kind of creative is sort of living in there. Can you talk a bit about how that's structured, like how your team has set up the different functions to be able to support the brands that you have?
Yeah. And because our brands are in different verticals, right? And they do have different customer bases, right? Like Wild One, like if you don't have a dog, you're probably not going to care about Wild One products, right? But if you do have a dog, you're going to have a really deep connection to the brand if you see some of the creatives, right? Versus, W&P is our kitchen, our home, our home and kitchen brand, where like everybody could use one of those products, right? So like there are definitely different applications to the way that we approach things, I think, across the brands. But what centralizing really allows us to do is to take learnings and share them across brands, right? So if, for an example, we recently launched a new product with Wild One, a new toy product that has done extremely well, both with our existing customers and with new customers. And I think what's been unique in it is we've tried different approaches with creative and with some video first creative that have done extremely well. And so what we're able to do when we're centralized is say, hey, here's what's working, and let's identify some of the variables that we think are driving this and making this work better than past creatives. And we can go and apply those relatively quickly to the other brands. Whereas, being on the agency side, I think we often acted when I was at an agency as kind of that information sharing, but you have to anonymize it, right? I can't go tell you what another client is doing outright, but I could share some examples or kind of speak to it somewhat more cryptically. Whereas here we really have the ability to be like, this is exactly what's working, right? And you can get on the phone from one of the brand teams with somebody on another brand team to go, hey, like what is working for you guys? What isn't right now? Can you tell me how you approach this? Can we talk about how we could do something similar? Let's have a brainstorm session. And so you're really getting a lot more brain power and cross-brand sharing than we would get if we were set up, in these kind of silos or spinning brands out after they've scaled or anything like that. So I think it's a really helpful piece for us in growing and testing our creative. And then what we're working towards right now is really centralizing the data pieces alongside that too. So we're really excited for kind of the power that's going to put behind so much of our, go forward, because I think to your question around creative and approach too is, my maybe controversial POV right now is that targeting matters a lot less right now, a lot less than the product and the creative itself, because privacy rules are only going to continue to change, right? What people opt into and allow you to track them across is, going to continue to get more strict. It's not like we're going to go back to where we were. So there's a matter of collecting the first party and zero party information that you can from consumers as much as possible to use. But then the flip side is when you're going after new customers whose information you don't have, how do you connect with them, right? Because if I can't target, if I don't know you're a dog owner, right? How do I get you to pay attention, to me as a brand? And the answer is the creative, right? Having a really good creative, I think, to Seiya's point, things that speak to people, to speak to some of the emotional appeal of why they might buy a product, rather than before. I think you could just put a product and a price in front of somebody because you know that they were looking for it. And it's like, okay, here you go, come and buy it, right? And now it's much more about how do you create that emotional connection? And that really comes through from creative.
Gareth, I want to come to you in a second on this, but Rose, just kind of while you're on this topic, I'm curious, can you talk a bit about how the team is structured? Like, just kind of talk a little bit about the roles and the different team members that are on the team and kind of what they contribute to.
Yeah, so we have some of our team lives at our brand levels and operates from Wild One or WMP or Current, and then a good chunk of our team is also centralized through the platform level through Very Great. And so what lives at the brand level is often things that need to be really brand specific, right? So like product, some operation related things might be very brand specific. A lot of the times brand marketing and performance marketing, right, can be more nuanced to, obviously the brand piece is huge for specific brands, and performance marketing to a certain extent can be very brand specific too, depending on goals and budgets. So those things live at our brand levels. And then at the platform level, we have, additional operations and sales and finance and all the not so sexy stuff, the back end type pieces that power the company, right? But we also have, this centralized growth team and creative and web that support across all of the brands. And so that's where really these are people who are then I work with all three of the brands every day. I talk to someone from each of the brands probably once an hour, it seems. And so what I'm able to do is really quickly share that information across teams and across different counterparts, and our creative and our web, day-to-day workers too are working, the employees are working across the brands too. So they're really able to go, okay, I was just talking to WMP when we were talking about this, and I think that this could actually apply to Wild One. So I'm going to go take it to them right now, rather than, I have to pass this to somebody else who's going to pass it to somebody else who's going to pass it on to somebody else. So it's structured in a way that allows us to be very nimble and very quick to make changes.
Very cool. And Gareth, to you, I've had the pleasure of meeting some of the members of your creative team, Tess and Nick, and I'm huge fans of theirs and what you guys have been able to build there. Can you talk a bit about your creative team and how that came to be? How does it work, and how do you guys set that up?
Yeah, so we got a creative director who reports directly into me, and then we've got a team of videographers, animators, graphic designers, photography, and then we actually just hired a full-time TikTok content person. So we actually have a fairly robust roster, all within that creative team. We only have 2 brands, unlike these other 2 fine folks. We only have 2 brands that we need to manage. Actually, we used to have 4, and we sold off all of our stuff that was kind of sub 8-figure revenue or up, so that we could focus a little bit more, because we were noticing that you really just get pulled between a lot. So we just have that one creative team that focuses on both our 2 brands. And yeah, they're doing as you know, Reza, they're doing just a great job.
And how do you think about that so who else? What else are you responsible for in your role as CMO? So you have the creative team.
Yeah, great question. So the way we structured it up is that the folks who report into me are our director of CX. So I'm just immediately aware of anything CX related. I kind of call it the windshield of the business. They get to see everything, but that also means that the bugs hit them first. And then we have our director of growth reports into me, and our creative director, and actually up until recently also our head of DX digital experience reported into me, but now we're developing some mobile applications and some more complicated technology. So we just reshuffled that a little bit. So get to spend a lot more of my time focused on growth, CX, and creative nowadays.
Nice. And Rose touched on this, but basically on the topic of basically trying to fuse together a little bit what happens on the creative side, and say even you mentioned this around like taking the high level messaging around creative and then making sure that's consistent throughout some of the performance campaigns. I'm curious how the three of you think about like creating some of that like feedback loop and just general collaboration between what happens on the performance side and what happens on the creative side. I'm interested in like the process, but also just even culturally. So a lot of people obviously talk about this idea that, you know, the creative team and the performance team, sometimes like the way that they view the world might be a little bit different, like their focuses and their goals are a little bit different. And I imagine as like growth leaders, the idea is like, how do you create a bridge between those two worlds, and so that you have the kind of best of both operating together. And I know that that's obviously like a moving target and something to work towards, but maybe some things that have worked well for each of you, and just generally, how do you approach trying to create that feedback loop between the two?
I'm happy to.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Gareth, please first.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we found it. We have very integrated creative and growth teams, and a lot of that is we almost just think about creative as performance creative. My team, like, just on their own went and took like the Harmon Brothers courses, so like they're just right from the get-go thinking about like it's not just creative in terms of like a woozy-wazy type perspective. It's really just like how can the teams support one another. And we run like artistic experiments, don't get me wrong. We even, like, our animator came up with this little animated adorable version of, I mean, it'd be too complicated to screen share right now, but we have this like little cartoon character Lomi asset that was created in Blender that we're kind of like dropping into different videos, and just a weird little thing that we figured out that we can test around on creative, and maybe it works. So I think just making sure that both those teams know, obviously growth doesn't need to be reminded that their responsibility is to grow things. But from the creative side as well, hiring lots of folks with kind of an entrepreneurial bent, or actually an entrepreneurial background, that really helps. You don't need to educate people on like, hey, your art's got to make money. So we've been fortunate from that perspective, just to really like that performance creative, and hiring the right people has really put us in a good position from that perspective.
I totally agree. I mean, it is definitely a mind shift sort of type of discussion, right? Like, I like working with like my creative director, for instance, like cares about the health of our business, like cares about the growth side of things. Like, she may not be in the weeds on the day-to-day, right, like looking at all the numbers, but having a team that genuinely cares about the performance of the campaigns at the end of the day has been really valuable, and making sure that sort of mindset is instilled within the teams, I think has been important. Taking one step back, I think one thing that has worked out really well within the teams is we created a pretty in-depth brand book within Keeps that really helps both teams understand like who our guy is, who what they care about, what types of people they are, where they live, sort of both a qualitative and quantitative like assessment of our customer base, and then translating that into more or less the major messaging hits that we need to think about when we're creating, whether it be like a brand creative that, like I said, we have billboards of in New York City, to all the way down to the the growth ads that are on Facebook or TikTok and things like that, and making sure that type of mentality and messaging is something that's prevalent across all areas. Like, look, there are times we're all moving quickly. There are times where this is not perfect. There are times where we may get something from the growth team, we look at it from a brand perspective and go like, how did this get through? Like, of course that's happening, but I think it's much less frequent than I've seen it in other areas, especially if both teams are behind that set of knowledge that they can already use. And so it's sort of like how you need your creative team to think about the growth side, but you also need the growth side to be thinking a little bit about the brand as well, right? Because for many of the people who see our ads for the seeing our ads, like that's the first experience they're ever having with our brand, right? And so if they're sort of seeing a very different type of messaging than they would get on our website, like that's going to create some issues, within that experience. So I think that that's been a huge piece for us. That's really important, I think, to make sure you get across to the teams.
Seiya,
Yeah.
just sorry, Rose, I'll come to you in a second. Wanted to ask one thing on to Seiya before we go to you on that. Is you mentioned your creative director, and like structurally, does your creative director report to you as VP of marketing, or how's that structured?
Yeah. So right now it's a little bit of a unique or a complex situation because we have the creative team for 30 Madison as a whole reporting into me. That's a creative director, some designers, copywriter, et cetera, sort of internally that helps all of our brands up from, our highest, brand, our highest, more sort of robust, scaled brands all the way down to the ones that are just starting out, launching and growing, as we speak. So, having to have that balance is, tricky at times, but it's something that's really important, I think, so that all the designers, all the creative folks can, share their learnings, together as one team and be able to, learn from each other and be able to like create repeatable processes across all those brands. I think is also, something that's been really important, with that type of team structure. So we've, it's fairly new for us, but we're starting to already see some successes there because we're able to apply, learnings from one brand to another and all that good stuff.
Cool. And Rose, what about you? Since joining Very Great, what sort of things have you been implementing process-wise to try to keep the information like flowing and create that kind of collaboration across the two different functions?
Yeah, so there's something Seiya said around like the brand book and the brand voice, right? And like being able to like have everyone kind of working together rather than everything just flowing one direction or the other, that I think is really important. When I used to pre-agency side, I spent several years in the fashion world, and I worked with a creative director who was really great, really talented, but I was, on the marketing side, I was using data behind like, this is what's going to work and what's not going to work across our social, our web, our email. And we would often disagree because he'd be like, but this visually looks really great. And I'm like, that's cool, but no one's going to engage with it. And so then where does that really get us? Right. And so like very much, loved so much of my time and my work there, but like very much got to see like how when those things don't speak together, you often end up kind of working towards what feels like separate goals at the end of the day. And so I think what we're doing here, and we're actually in the process of kind of revamping all of our approach to naming things, right, is like using data to really power kind of in both directions. And I think the way we're structured, we have digital designers who work specifically for digital, right, and are taking a lot of learnings and working very quickly with the teams to iterate on them. But I think it's, you have to have in what you're doing, you have to have a really robust understanding of like what's working and what's not working, right? Because creative can often be subjective, right? You can look at two things that are very similar, technically speaking, go, this really resonates and this doesn't for whatever reason, right? But you can do your best to try to kind of tie back the different variables on it, right? And the different things that might move performance. Maybe it's a different type of background, right? Like I've got this like green background behind me right now, right? People jokingly call it my green screen, right? But like, is it a colorful background that resonates with people? Does products perform better on a neutral background? Do people resonate more when there's short videos, when there's different types of copy, right? When it's testimonial, whatever it is, like being able to tag out all of those different types of variables in your data is super important, because then you can go back and you can say, okay, if this one ad did really well, I think what often happens is people go, something did really well and they want to go replicate it, but they don't really know how, right? And they go, okay, well, like, let's go make another of this same thing. But it's like, what about it worked? And do we know what about it worked? Have we tested against it, right? Do we know if we ran the same ad with different copy, did it suddenly tank, right? So was it actually the copy and not the creative itself, or did the copy not matter? And it was like a particular moment, are we looking at like how long people are watching videos, at what point they're engaging with things. So I think like putting data behind everything is extremely important. And I think really drives a lot of things. But to Seiya's point of having a brand book, right? You can do that up to a point, but you can also go down a hole of over optimizing towards something that actually isn't your brand or isn't necessarily going to resonate. Because I think for a lot of consumers, their first touch point with brands these days is through some form of advertising, whether they realize it or not, right? Sometimes it's just influencer posts that they don't really realize they're starting to interact with ads. So I think like having a really strong POV from a brand perspective, but being able to understand like how can you shift within that, right? Like, where do we go? Okay, I think like for us, a big piece that we're working towards too is better defining our personas and what types of things are going to interact or engage with different types of personas, right? So, if I'm if I'm a millennial woman, which I am, right? Like what's going to pull me in is going to be different from what pulls like a Gen Z woman into purchasing a product, right? And so understanding and putting data behind like the variances, there's always outliers, right? But I think like what we're really trying to do is put more of those processes in place. And we do a lot of information sharing back and forth across, all the way down to people who are doing digital design. Here's what's working, here's what's not working. And then bringing that back up and kind of taking a macro view and, going back and forth. But yeah, it's very much putting those processes in place.
Nice.
Yeah, I think one of the sort of proud moments I've had with seeing, that type of work, across both the brand and growth sides has been in certain meetings where, a growth marketer on my team may call out something as off brand and the brand marketer sort of says, well, I don't know if this will work because, our data has seen, so-and-so, type of creative work better. And so if you can have like, to some degree, your teams being able to sort of interject each other like in that way, I think has been, super helpful. Another piece that Rose sort of mentioned that I want to speak to as well is on the influencer side, because we do a lot of influencer work on Keeps, and that's a really important reason why we did some of this work and we crafted the type of messaging that we want, is because sometimes you can't fully control what goes out there, right? And so, influencer are a good example where we, want to give like the talking points, the sort of areas in which we, want the influencer to touch upon, if they're making a video or if they're sort of posting about it. And yes, we have like, some degree of approval process to it, but you also want to allow the influencer to put their own personality into it, right? Because that's why you're working with them in the first place. And so being able to have like a really strong, point of view in those areas allows them to also have that like playground to work with, which has also been important for some of our marketing strategies that are less, in our control, if that makes sense.
Right. And so from each of you, when you kind of think about this process, a lot of it is around getting the data over to the people that are actually going to create the content. So like, what does that process look like for you? Like, is there like a reporting structure? Is there a meeting that happens on some sort of cadence? How are you kind of structuring the workflow to be able to gather those insights and then share it with the right people?
Yeah, I think on our side, there's several different meetings that happen, right? We work with an agency that's actually executing our media, right? So a lot of the times it kind of starts there, and we will bring in people from creative if needed to like join, when there's particular pieces of feedback, or make sure that those get shared over and go, okay, hey, here's like, we're getting feedback that this new asset type that we're trying is not resonating, right? Or that we need to test and change some things. So it really starts there with like having meetings where we're getting the feedback from like what's working, what's not working, right? And then being able to take that information internally and go, okay, how do we iterate on this, right? Because we are sharing information across brands too. A lot of the times we go, hey, well, if W&P wants to maybe change the way they're approaching TikTok, and this is what we've seen working for Wild One for TikTok lately, so we can take that information and then go, okay, how can we apply this? And so then there's meetings with the marketing and creative teams internally to go, okay, how do we iterate on these things? We use Slack as internal communication, so a lot of the times it's like quick back and forth of like, hey, just heard that this team is doing this, that Wild One has been running this type of creative here, like would love to talk in our next meeting about how we can get something like that set up, right? So we kind of kickstart that process, and it becomes kind of this ongoing type of feedback loop across the board. And as we centralize more of our data too, we're really looking to build out centralized views for everybody to be able to then go in and see like what's working and what's not working across brands, so that it kind of eliminates the need for somebody to raise it up, but rather you can go in and be like, oh, cool, I can see like they just tried this, they just completely changed or revamped the way they were approaching creative, or when they launched this new product, like here's where they really leaned in heavier and this worked or didn't work. So we do a lot of things that are evolving, I think, but like a lot of putting kind of those processes in place for information sharing.
We're very similar. It's a beautiful mess of reports and couple meetings and lots of Slack. It just also so happens that the CEO of Pela, my business partner, Matt, it also comes from a performance marketing background. So we have the disservice to our entire team of we've got two hardcore direct response marketer guys in the CEO and CMO seat. And then we've got a bunch of really talented people, both on the growth and performance marketing side, two wonderful agencies, one that does case and one that does Lomi, and then a great creative team. So yeah, often some of the best campaign ideas actually will come from any member of the team and sort of get refined at any level, and then come into fruition. So on some days I'm like, oh, I really should spend way more time like optimizing these systems and clarifying things up. And we did just actually hire like a marketing org project manager who's doing a great job, because I don't have an organized bone in my body, if I'm being real. And then other days when it's just chaos and beautiful and people are like having crazy ideas bouncing off of one another, I'm like, you know what, the chaos works. I'll keep this forever. This is good.
Yeah, don't have too much to add. That's already been said. Like I said, I just think it's that constant communication from all sides that's super important. Like we have an agency that we use for some of our scaled, businesses that has been really helpful. And I think going back again to that, organizing that messaging has been really important for our third-party partners as well. And so being able to figure out from them what works and doesn't work at a certain level of scale, all the way down to our smaller businesses where we do most of that creative in-house. And that, like I said before, has been a lot of shared learnings across like what has worked at certain levels of scale, what's the type of messaging that works. Because for us, just because the telehealth space is so personal, and it's a very important decision that a lot of people are making. You really have to lean into telling that story and being able to share what types of stories have worked across all of our different brands has been really helpful for all the different experiments that we may want to run, no matter what size the brand is.
Very cool. Very good. I also want to make sure we have enough time for questions. So for the people in the audience, start getting your questions ready. You can either type them into the chat box and I'll read them, or if you want to be brave and make it a little bit more interactive, just put your raised hand up and I can push a little button here for allow to talk, and you can just ask your question directly. So if you have any questions, either dump it in the chat or click on the raised hand feature, and would love to get to you and have you ask your question to these talented growth leaders. And while we wait for that, one of the things I wanted to get your perspectives on is this idea of like a role that I think is emerging. Either it's like a formal role that somebody does, or more practically, it's just like a hat that somebody wears day to day, like a function that somebody does. And at Motion, we've been thinking a lot about this in terms of like the creative strategist role as basically the person or the hat or the function or like the job to be done of basically figuring out what's worked in the past and coming up with direction on where to go next. So this could be the person who's kind of managing the scripting process, managing the creative sprint cycle, interacting with the different content creators or the video editors to bring it all to life. So basically like thinking about it from how does the sausage get made on the actual creative side? How does that look like for your teams? I know it is, I've yet to see a team where this is like, exactly the same. So I think there is a lot of the beautiful chaos that each of you mentioned, which I think is like more of a feature and not a bug, which I think is great. But how does that happen? How does that happen for your teams? Like who effectively is wearing that hat of creative strategy? And if it's shared, how does that work?
So yeah, we definitely do revert to chaos again, having like a CMO and CEO who both like will literally like Matt and I will independently write scripts overnight and like send them to Tess, our creative director. And I think then what we benefit from less than like a creative strategist per se is almost like a creative filter. So she'll just like very politely and quietly just like murder any ideas that are like terrible if we just send her like a bad script that we just haven't refined. We're like, this is whatever, this is going to get made. And then if it just doesn't get made and there's other wonderful things that are getting made, you just naturally are like, okay, great, like process of natural selection, totally happy with that. And often that's where you'll like get better ideas refined out. But yeah, we're a little bit just fast and loose with the scripts, with the new creative concepts, and it works for us.
It's interesting. Yeah, we don't have a role like that internally today. I feel like it's mostly on the the growth marketers to service up what has worked. I see one of the questions in the chat. This may start to answer a little bit of that question, but it really depends on the type of ad and what we're trying to accomplish with that ad, and looking into all the different metrics that speaks to whatever that performance is. And so if it's like a top of funnel, we just want to drive traffic or first touch to our site, that obviously is going to have a very different type of story or lens than something that's basically at the sort of consideration purchase stage, where we're just trying to drive them to make that the last purchase visit. So yeah, we don't have like a formalized, I would say, role like that. It's really interesting. I honestly would love to hear other opinions on that role, but it's something that we are sort of actively doing more as a within the teams themselves versus like having one person strictly do it themselves.
Yeah, we don't have that creative strategist specific role either necessarily. We did recently add more to our team from like the project management perspective, but I think we also maybe a little bit of the beautiful mess of there are multiple voices, right? And I think that that's important to a certain extent, because I think like I see that question too around like iterating on creative versus dumping a concept, and I think that this is like kind of an important piece of this, right? Is if it all lives with one person, right? Because creative can be subjective, but also like you can put data behind it, right? So you have to have the balance of both. And so I think the way we really see it is there are the people who are like approaching it more from like the brand tone of voice, right? Like the more subjective way of approaching, creative, or how we want to speak to something or how we want to put something out in the world. And then that gets kind of balanced through the lens of performance, right? Like, okay, like, is this something that, have we tried this before and did it not work at all? Do we think that this is something that could actually perform really well, but we need to put X tweak on it, right? Like, and so like having both of those types of voices, both the brand driven voice and the performance driven voice, I think are really important when you're thinking about creative, because otherwise you end up, like we said before, optimizing way too heavily for the performance piece, or you go really deep on the brand piece, but it's not necessarily going to resonate. So it's really kind of a balance of those two.
Nice. And so one of the last questions that I have for you, and then also giving the opportunity, anybody else, if you want to ask a question, feel free to dump it in. And Roy, if you feel like you didn't get a full answer there, let us know and we can elaborate. But I think both Rose and Seiya kind of took your question. Let me know if you're looking for anything more specific there, we can elaborate. One of the things that I think would be cool to get your perspectives on is each of your companies, you have some pretty strong like resources there, right? You can get a lot done. You're all kind of have the benefit of having some pretty good resources to get a lot done. But a lot of teams might be earlier on and they don't have that luxury. Maybe the teams look a little bit more scrappy and they're trying to kind of grow their businesses to a level where hopefully one day they can have the amount of resources that you all do. But if you had to advise teams that are a little bit smaller that maybe need to get a lot more done with less, how would you advise them to think about, what's the best way to get as much done with as few resources as possible to kind of be able to get the most like bang for the buck from an output standpoint if they're not working at companies or own companies at the level of the three of yours?
Ooh, okay. I mean, you can get the spicy answer or the polite one. I mean, the spicy answer is, holy fuck, there are like 21-year-old kids selling like gorilla like action figure things that they just made up on TikTok by like sharing videos of like the gorilla man. I don't know, I can't remember what it's called on TikTok, but like just some kid came up with like this gorilla guy, and he films it and he sells shitloads of gorillas. And there's another dude who just came up with like Tabs chocolate. It's like this super unbelievably expensive chocolate, high AOV. He seems like he's got a good DR head on the shoulders, but it's all like TikTok like you figured out how to just crowdsource a whole shitload of different creators out there. Like if you are having trouble iterating creative faster, like go work in government. I don't know. Like just it's not that hard. Seriously.
I mean, I have maybe a very not sexy answer to this that is totally the opposite. But I think to like your question of like, how do you do this is like, it's about putting processes in place like very early on. I think a lot of the times when people are working for and like this is, I mean, you can still iterate on creative fast with processes, right? If anything, you can do it faster. But like a lot of the times when people are working in small and scrappy teams, they go, we'll worry about that later. We'll worry about how we're going to like come back and look at this in a macro way or like aggregate information or whatever at a later point. Right now, we're just going to do what we need to do. And so that, but then what happens when you go from being like a team of 1 or 2 or 5 to a team of 10 or 15 or 20 or however many more is you go, oh shit, well now everyone's like doing all these different things and no one's really sharing information or, you know, like these things that need to get passed on to somebody else, like it all lives in someone's head, right? Or like, you know, particularly as people change jobs, right? Like there's so much risk in like, if someone was owning something and doing everything top to bottom themselves and there was no process put around it, there was no documentation of it, there was no reporting, whatever it was that like they were doing this, oh, I can like, we, you know, worked with a lot of people who go, oh, I know how to go in and pull this data real quick myself. So I'm just going to go and keep doing it. And then you kind of uncover that like, they're doing this really manual thing every week because they know how to do it. They've made a really fast way that works for themselves. But like, if they leave, if they change roles, if they add to their team, whatever, now it suddenly becomes, oh, somebody else needs to own this. And there's no way for them to do that. It puts a lot of like risk into one person. And so, yeah, it's like a very not sexy answer here, but the not spicy answer, I would say the really boring answer. But it really is true is like having some level of processes in place. Cause I think to one more thing on like Roy's question of like iterating on creative versus dumping a concept is like a lot of the times people operate with like these hypotheses and they have a quick hypothesis and they like, you know, act on it and then it doesn't work the way they thought it was and then they move on and there's like no process to really go back and go, okay, well, why did this or didn't this work? Can we iterate on it? Does it make sense to try something different? Like, and if you don't have any process built in from the beginning, it becomes very hard to identify why something did or didn't work or whether or not you should spend more time on it. So yeah, it's not a spicy answer.
The only thing I'll add is, you know, especially nowadays, there are so many services out there that help like non-designers, you know, put stuff together to get stuff done, whether it's like landing pages with like Unbounce and Instapage, like Canva, right? Like the list kind of goes on of all these different, you know, services out there that you can get, you know, if you have one marketer in your company, or if you are the one marketer, like just sign up for those things and test it out, try something, you know, chances are you could probably put something half decent together. And to Gareth's point, you know, no one's going to care that it's not perfect, especially at that stage that you are. So test what works and then figure that out. And then obviously, like, as you grow, it can be more polished, but it doesn't have to be perfect, right? Like, you know, I don't want to use the cliche, but like, it's truly that, like, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Like just test something, try something, you know, continue to iterate. And that's honestly the type of mentality that I have, no matter what size company you're at, right? And I think it's important to have, no matter what you are.
Cool. Okay, and so question here from Roy, I'll just read it out. This is all super helpful. Very much appreciate you guys. One more, we do have time. So here's Roy's question. Are you coming up with a specific hypothesis for every creative test you run? And how many times would you test it with different creative batches until you're happy with statistical significance and take those learnings for future concepts?
So we will typically approach things to have, like, our hypothesis is always we're going to be running on, like, is this going to increase traffic? Is this going to improve conversion rate? Is this pushing a new offer? Like, we always start everything from like, what is the desired outcome of that? And then, I mean, how many times would we test it with different creative batches until we're like statistical significance? I'm afraid to say it. We run probably more off of vibe, a combination of vibes and statistics. Like, here's the truth, like, everyone here, we can all number our creative and all that shit to death. And there are obviously tools like Motion that are helpful in terms of understanding, like, hey, is this like scroll step? But I'll often use those tools more confirmatory or like hypothesis supporting. If you're looking at something, you're like, well, this isn't converting well. If you're looking, you see that the narrative within an ad has a mismatch on an LP. Like there are a lot of different things outside of just strictly the creative to be looking at. Creative is part of story. We're all storytellers and we're all telling stories to all these anonymous people through the internet. We want to be making sure that like the stories that we're telling are not in the wrong fucking bound book. If it has a totally different title than like the final page, you're going to get yourself into trouble. So we'll often like run with a concept and test a couple different variations on that, what we call like desired outcomes. But yeah, I mean, I guess we're at a place where when we spin something up, we get to statistically significant spend on it relatively quickly. But if you're smaller and you're not feeling like that statistical significance is there yet, it's okay to just run it off vibes. That's how I've started all of my like smallest stuff, is just like, does this feel right? Okay, well, if I got that right, then we're gonna have a good time. Yeah, I feel like people have gotten, because we have all these tools that you have all these statistics about, they try to stat it to death, but I think it's important to hold both. Like you're a human, you also know what works.
Completely agree with that, especially if you're at less of a scale. Like don't wait like the 2 or 3 weeks or whatever it would take to get statsig. Like that's just, you know, a waste of time at that stage. Like I think it's really important for you to just continue, you know, testing and evolving, you know, versus just holding that truth. Like, of course, if you have it, great. Like that tells you, you know, that particular, you know, metric that you care about. But I also don't necessarily, you know, fully wait for that on every single test that I run, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to, you know, continue the learnings that you're going to need to continue growing.
Yeah, and one thing that might be helpful here, Roy, too, is when you kind of think about hypothesis, you can also break it up into basically like 3 parts, and I think you mentioned in your previous point. So you can have a hypothesis around like what's going to capture the most attention up front in the video, and like look at the thumb stop to validate that, or what's going to drive the most click through to get people over to a landing page, and what's going to get the most conversion. And I think you kind of need those hypotheses, kind of to Gareth's point. Like you need to go look at the data to validate your own assumptions. So if you have those in mind already, then you can go and look at the data and see what it has to say. But I think if you chunk it out into those separate blocks, then you can get a bit more of like a precise answer on, okay, maybe the thumb stop was working good, but the click-through rate was not that great. And so when you do an iteration, you're not necessarily iterating on the whole creative, but you're iterating on just that one piece that you're looking to implement. And so, yeah, it looks like we had a couple of questions on the Q&A. Gareth, thanks for answering one. Rose, looks like you're typing an answer to another one. So I'll just maybe read it out for people in the audience, and then we can wrap up. So Dorian asked, outside of the marketer creative agency relationship, have you found any other departments in your companies that have been surprisingly helpful as you've been evolving your orgs to use data to drive growth and creative decisions? And Gareth says that their CX team is incredibly important part of the marketing team if you want rapid feedback from the CX team on how the audience is responding to your creatives and things like that. So that's his answer there. But yeah, guys, feel free to answer those verbally if you want. You can do that too, and then we can.
No, I was just going to say huge +1 to that on the CX side. Like our care team, you know, especially in the space that we're in, it's so important to capture that customer voice and be able to share that back. The way that I see it, like the marketing team sees things from like a macro perspective, while the CX, like your care team, sees things from the, you know, the day-to-day, like what customers are writing in about, like talking about. And so that's been a huge important part of a feedback loop that exists that I think is really important to maintain.
Yeah, and
Very
I think
cool.
sorry, Dorian, on your other question around like you know, organizations' relationship with data evolving on the brand marketing side, is it more independent, or, you know, using opportunity or using data to inform those campaigns too? Is I would say it's very much the latter. Like it's, if you have your brand marketers operating in a silo and they're just operating independently of your performance, independently of your data, like you're going to end up with a lot of wasted time. It reminds me of what the example I was giving before when I worked in fashion, and I had a creative director who created really beautiful images aesthetically that just sometimes would not resonate, right? And was not really open to that creative feedback. And so we would end up, you know, I'd be like, okay, cool, we can test this and put it out there, and it would do about 25% of what our other types of approaches would do. And so I think like putting the data behind it, right, is an extremely important piece. Like that said, I do think like data can be subjective to a certain extent too, and you can cut it to tell any story you want, right? So like you have to take kind of that human lens from time to time too, right? And like it's extremely important to retest, right? If your brand marketers feel very strongly that the idea they have is going to work for whatever reason, maybe you're rebranding, maybe you're refreshing some things, maybe you're launching a new product, you're trying to reach a new consumer, like you have to retest and you have to go, okay, we're going to take the data we have, but here's how we test against it and see how that's potentially changing or shifting with where we're headed. But like I would definitely say we don't want them operating in a silo from everything else.
Well, Rose, Seiya, Gareth, really appreciate your time. I know we're up on the hour, and so I just wanted to thank you all for participating and sharing all of your insights. Thanks for everybody who attended as well. We'll shoot over a recording of the session as well, so everybody has a copy. And yeah, hope you all have a great rest of your week. Thanks so much again for joining us.